Welcome to Impact Factor, your weekly dose of commentary on a new medical study. I'm Dr. F. Prey Wilson of the Yale School of Medicine, and as you may notice, we're doing things a little bit differently this week. My usual producer, Ryan McAvoy, is out on a well-deserved vacation, so I'm shooting this in my office via webcam, using some PowerPoint. I'm doing my best to get some video editing skills here coming into play. So this is Impact Factor. And this week, what we are talking about is guns. So, I think it's been the summer of the gun to some extent. You've got the Highland Park mass shooting on July 4th, which was such a terrible tragedy. Of course, the Uvalde shooting at Robb Elementary School is still fresh in our minds, and there have been many mass shootings. It would be too long a video to list all the mass shootings that have occurred this summer, but I do want to remember the shooting at the Tulsa, Oklahoma hospital, where two physicians lost their lives. Mass shootings, though, are in some sense the tip of the iceberg. So far in 2022, there have been 323 mass shootings in the U.S., so that is a sort of astounding number to think about, given that we're just a little bit more than halfway through the year. But when it comes to gun violence in the United States, that's just sort of a marker, the most extreme thing we see. I think mass shootings, generate so much discussion and so much interest because of the magnitude of the tragedy, obviously, and also the kind of chaotic nature, the randomness, the feeling that no one is safe, right? But really, if you look at the numbers in terms of gun deaths, so far in 2022, there's been 22,864 gun deaths in the United States. This is courtesy of the Gun Violence Archive. And the vast majority, obviously, are not part of mass shootings. In fact, if you look at the data, the majority of gun deaths in the U.S. in 2022 are due to suicide, gun-based suicide. And of course, there's, a significant chunk that are homicides, accidents, etc. But we don't talk about suicide in the context of gun violence as often as we should, especially given that the majority of deaths come from gun suicide. And I want to change that this week a little bit. Now, using a gun to attempt suicide is about the most effective way it can possibly be done. So this is a study from Annals of Internal Medicine in 2019, which looked at fatal suicides across the U.S. And you can see that, for example, pill-based, overdosing, deliberate overdosing as a suicide attempt results in death less than 2% of the time. This has got to be the most ghoulish infographic I've ever seen, but so I apologize for that. But you can see kind of the lethality of various forms of attempted suicide, and nothing comes close to the 90% mortality rate of suicide attempt by gun. This may seem pedantic, but this is what guns are designed to do. They're designed to kill, and they are very effective at doing that. Because of this, there's obviously this is one front on in the question of where guns belong in American society, and focusing on suicide, I think, is a reasonable point because of statistics like these. Now, people will say, oh, well, people who are determined to commit suicide will find a way. Whether they have a gun, whether they have access to a gun or not, they're going to find a way. But the data doesn't really support that. So this is data, from California in 2020, New England Journal. California is one of those states that just has much better records on these kind of things than many other states, which is why you see a lot of research out of California on this. And basically what it looks at is the suicide rate among gun owners versus non-gun owners, and the gun suicide rate, suicide by gun rate amongst gun owners and non-gun owners. And I've stratified here by men and women, and just talking about the suicide rate overall, significantly higher in people who own guns. So, part of that, of course, is explained by the fact that if you own a gun, it is much easier to successfully commit suicide. You can see that the gun suicide rate here, this is per 100,000 individuals, I believe. The gun suicide rate here, 44 versus 49, the overall suicide rate. In other words, if you own a gun, and you are going to commit suicide, you're pretty much committing suicide via gun, whereas people who are non-gun owners, obviously much less likely to commit suicide, both overall and, of course, gun-based suicide. So it's not just that, people will figure out a way. Guns are incredibly, incredibly effective methods in terms of ending life. And that may be a real problem. One thing I want to point out, which is interesting about this data set actually, is that the overall mortality rate, cancer and heart disease and stuff like that, is actually a bit lower in gun owners. They may be overall a healthier bunch, and I'm not sure exactly what the explanation for that is, whether it's kind of outdoorsy, hunting, things like that, getting more exercise, I don't know. But, but the suicide rate is just so dramatically, 3 to 5-fold higher in men, almost 30 times higher in women who are gun owners. So it is a major risk factor. And partly that may be because access to a gun, because it's so effective, if you have it there and you have that moment where, the depression is so deep and you lose control, the access, that's it, right? Like you can be done at that point because the gun is so effective. You don't need much of a plan. You just need access to a gun. This is showing you the rate of people in the same study not dead from suicide. So this curve is showing you how people die from suicide who are gun owners compared to non-gun owners, and in the dashed line. And one thing I just want to point out is that this is from the time that the gun is purchased, and there's kind of a steep slope here before it starts to level out to a more static process. So that curve is what I want to draw your attention to here. This is data that's been replicated in several data sets, which suggests that the highest risk of suicide is shortly after you purchase a gun. And keep that in mind because that bears directly on the study I want to talk to you about today, which appears in JAMA Network Open. You can see the title here, Machine Learning Analysis of Handgun Transactions to Predict Firearm Suicide. The team is below here. You might recognize the name Garen Wintemute. He is a very prominent gun violence researcher who's written a lot on this subject, a pretty knowledgeable guy. So what's interesting here is that because we know the risk of suicide increases substantially right after you buy a gun, can we predict the risk of suicide at the time you buy a gun? And if we can, what should we do with that information? So this is how this study was set up. Basically, it's a California study because they have very good records. Anytime a handgun changes hands in California, it has to be recorded by law on the dealer's record of sale worksheet, which is a long worksheet, but it basically registers, who had the gun and who gave it to who, and information about the gun itself, and so on and so forth. They had 1.9 million people in this database, which represents almost 5 million handgun purchases. This is common. People who own guns tend to own more than one guns, tend to purchase more than one gun. And of these, 1.9 million people, 2,614 died by handgun suicide. That was linked to vital statistics data from the state of California. Okay, so that's our setup, right? We know who bought a gun and when. We know the characteristics of the gun, and we know that some small but not, significant proportion of them would die by suicide. And their category here is within the next year, within the next 12 months after buying that gun. That's their target for prediction. So, based on these forms, they had actually a lot of things that could go into a machine learning model to predict suicide, demographics, right, age, sex, race, ethnicity, so on and so forth. They had the geocoded addresses of the purchaser of the gun and the dealer of the gun, census tract information that tells you things, like poverty, insurance status, on average for where you're coming from. County level firearm ownership and suicide information. So that sort of standardizes people to the place where they come from. Is this a county that has a high level of suicide at baseline, regardless of gun ownership, in which case maybe over overall risk is going to be higher. But also characteristics about the gun itself. What's the caliber, the chamber size, what type of handgun are we talking about? And in particular, a revolver versus a semi-automatic. Characteristics of the transaction itself, and importantly, the number of prior purchases that this individual has made over the past, 1, 2, 5, 10 years. So all of these are potential predictors of suicide, but how does it work? Can you predict suicide based just on this information? They used a machine learning algorithm called a random forest. So I'm going to just take a brief divergence to tell you how random forests work. It's sort of a family of machine learning algorithms. But if you look on the left of your screen here, this is what's called a decision tree, and it's a really simple algorithm which takes a single factor at the top. And splits it into two pieces. Let's say the predictor is age, okay? So your top predictor here is going to be age, and the algorithm will walk through the age in order from youngest to oldest, trying various splits and measuring how different, now that you've created two groups split at this age level, how different they are in terms of the risk of suicide, for example, okay? And so it'll find kind of the best dividing line of age, 55 years, and then this is a good split. So we have the under 55 over here and the older 55 over here, and that really, there's a pretty good difference in suicide rates when you split like that. And that takes you to the second level of the decision tree, where you can have another factor, let's say, sex, which obviously splits, is not a continuous variable, splits more easily, or blood pressure, whatever the predictor is. And the algorithm just kind of marches down until you get to, a small number of people, and you have the overall, in this case, suicide rate at those endpoints. That's a single decision tree. They can work okay for some things, but what a random forest does is it creates literally a forest of these decision trees where they might start with a different factor. So instead, one tree might start with age, but one tree might start with handgun caliber size, for example. And so they're all made. Thousands of these decision trees are made. Each individual patient is then walked through each of the 1,000 decision trees, and at the end, they get a prediction whether they're yes, yes, we do think they're going to commit suicide, let's say in red, or no in green. And then those predictions are averaged across all 1,000 decision trees to get there's essentially all these different trees are now voting on what they think is likely to happen. And importantly, you get out a prediction that basically says yes or no. Yes, I think there will be a suicide, or no. But you also get a number that you can interpret sort of like a chance of suicide, but I don't want you to interpret it exactly like a chance of suicide, because it's a continuous number where higher is worse, but it doesn't actually map exactly to the percent risk of suicide. But you can get a continuous number out of this. So how did their model perform when they fed this data in? I'll let you know. They did this appropriately. They had a training set and a test set, validation set. It's fine. Statistically, it looks fine to me. Their AUC was 0.81. Now, people always ask me, what does that mean? The area under the curve, more specifically, the area under the receiver operator characteristic curve. This is a measure of discrimination, and the intuition here is that if you have an AUC of 0.81, what it means is that if you take one person in a data set who will commit suicide and one random person who won't commit suicide, your model will predict a higher score in the person who actually does commit suicide, who dies by suicide, 81% of the time. So it's comparing, it sort of balances the outcomes. So there's, it's saying if you had two people, one who had the outcome and one who didn't, how often do you pick the right person using your model? So in other words, 0.5 here would be no better than chance. And 1 would be perfect. So 0.81 is pretty good, but far from perfect, and I'll show you what that boils down to. Now, what matters, right? All these variables I told you, what can we learn about who's at risk here? Really interesting. So this shows one measure for how you can tell what's important in a machine learning model. Basically, it says, what this graph is saying is if you remove this factor, or you just mix up all the values in this factor so they're nonsense, how much do you hurt the accuracy of your prediction? And firearm category was the number one predictor in terms of increasing your accuracy. firearm category basically broke down to revolver versus semi-automatic handgun. And revolvers were people buying revolvers were at substantially higher risk. This is interesting because semi-automatics are the more common purchase, than revolvers. We can only speculate as to why this is a marker of suicide risk. One sort of obvious speculation here is that you don't need a high-capacity semi-automatic weapon to commit suicide, right? You only need really one bullet. A revolver might just do it just fine. Maybe more research needed there. Race and ethnicity important. White men tend to be at higher risk of suicide than other racial and ethnicity groups. The month of the year matters a little bit. I'll show you that and so on. But let's break down now to sort of what is the risk across the spectrum. So as I said, you're going to get a number at the end of this machine learning model that ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 is the model saying, I don't think you're at risk of it at all, and 1 is the model saying, I'm super certain you're at risk of suicide in the next year. And what they did is they broke these numbers down into ventiles, so just 20 equal-sized buckets. So the number of people in each bucket is the same. And you can see in the highest risk bucket here, so this is the top 5% of risk, almost 40% of those people commit suicide within the next year. So that's really high, right? And you can see down here at the lowest risk level, the lowest 5% of risk, the risk of suicide is almost 0. And that's just based on those factors I showed you going through this algorithm. So, this doesn't tell you anything about the mental status of the person. It doesn't, there's no interview here. There's no survey. There's no objective measures like blood pressure, heart rate, or anything like that. And yet you get some decent predictions. If you zoom in now, we're zooming in on those highest groups. So this is people kind of in the highest overall scores. And what you can see is now the people at 0.98 to 0.99, these super high scores, virtually all of these individuals actually end up committing suicide within a year. And that's really interesting, except that I need to point out that there are very few people in these highest groups. So this 0.95 and up group that I'm circling here, this 0.95 and up group has 35 people in it total. So you've got, 1 million gun purchases, and 35 of them come out to be super duper high risk. And they sure are, right? These people are very high risk of suicide, but you're going to miss a ton of people. Because very few people have all their stars aligned in the algorithm to have the highest possible score. So this looks really good, but you're not capturing everyone. You're just flagging super, super, super rare, ultra high risk individuals. So what I wanted to do is kind of give you an intuitive sense of how this works, right? We have these risk thresholds that the model is going to output, and what can we do with that information? And so full disclosure here, I had to do some of the math. This doesn't appear in the paper. I had to kind of back calculate some things, so I'm pretty sure I'm correct on these numbers, but not 100%. So please feel free to mention that in the comments if I got something wrong, if you're looking at the paper. But I think this is right. So basically, let's start here. If you target scores above 0, right? So that you're targeting everyone. Everyone has a score above 0. So that means whatever your intervention is at the point of sale, right? You calculate the risk at the point of sale, and you target people who are above the threshold. Well, all right, you target everyone, 100% of gun purchasers, and 100% of the people who will go on to commit suicide are in that group because it's everybody. Your positive predictive value, so what percent of people that you're targeting will go on to commit suicide, is 0.07%, because that's the suicide rate in the population of gun owners. And what could your intervention be? What would you do here? Well, you can't do much because this is literally everyone. It would be very expensive to do anything intensive on everyone, and I'm sure people would consider it potentially a violation of their rights or things like that. So I don't know what you could give some pamphlets maybe, right, at the point of gun sales, some information about the suicide hotline, etc. You're quite limited. But as you increase the score threshold to intervene, your options become more interesting. So for example, at a score threshold of 0.38, you're only targeting 29% of gun purchasers for this intervention. So, 70% just walk out the door. We don't think they're very high risk. But you'd capture 75% of the suicides. So only 30% of the purchasers, but you'd capture most of the suicides. Your positive predictive value has gone up a bit, 0.2%. And maybe now you can start thinking about some kind of outreach, maybe emails, checking in on people over time, something low cost. But you have potentially more options. Now, as we ramp this number up, like to 0.5, now you're only intervening on 10% of gun purchasers. You're still getting 50% of all the suicides at that level. So you're going to miss people. You're always going to miss people, but you're targeting a smaller group, so you can do more. Positive predictive value goes up to 0.3%, maybe a longer waiting period, for example. Oh, sorry, you're in the top 10% of suicide risk. You've got to wait a couple of months or something like that. Hey, I'm not a lawyer. This is not about the Constitution. I'm merely trying to explain how this works from a public health standpoint. A little bit higher, you might target only 5% of gun purchasers. Now you're getting 38.6% of suicides. Is that time that they need some kind of evaluation or something like that? Check in, see how they're doing, some professional to say, yeah, this is fine. And just to point it out, if you went really high, 0.9, well, almost no one buying a gun is going to meet that threshold. So only 0.1% of gun purchasers. Very rare that you'd reach that threshold. And of course, you'd miss a bunch of the suicides, but you'd get some. You'd get 4.4% of suicides. And in fact, 14.5% of everyone you intervened on would go on to die by suicide. So this is a very high positive predictive value. And this is the point where you start to wonder, like, okay, at this level, do we start to say, this risk, 14.5% of people are going to go on to commit suicide with this gun. Maybe you don't give them a gun. Of course, you've got 85% of people who weren't going to go on to suicide with this gun. These are difficult issues. Major limitation of this study, these are guns that were legally transferred from one person to another, a dealer or at a gun show or anything. I mean, they capture all these in California, but, illegally obtained and transferred guns are not going to appear in this data set. In fact, of all the gun suicides in California over this time period, only about 38% had appeared in the registry, right? So a bunch of them, 60% of these suicides kind of occurred, weren't really analyzed here because there was no gun purchase that could be documented. So that either means they got the gun from someone else, or potentially didn't register it or something like that. So there are limitations here. I think what's really interesting about this study is that if we think of how AI is going to move forward, so right now at that very high end, we could potentially target people who have 15% of whom are going to go on to commit suicide within a year, and you might say, well, I'm not going to, sacrifice the rights of the 85% of people who don't to protect the 15% of people who do. But at some point, these machine learning algorithms are going to get better, right? At some point, as more data gets collected, as we know more about people, you think about integrating social media posts or biometrics at the point of sale. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. What if you had a model that at some threshold was essentially 100% accurate, right? Oh, score above X, like we are 99.9% sure that this individual is going to go on to commit suicide within the next year. What do you do with that information? Can you do anything? Do you have to do something? We're not there yet. And so right now, this is sort of a cognitive exercise, and it echoes the sort of pre-crime concerns where, we don't want to live in a society where you can arrest someone before they've done anything wrong. But death by suicide is a bit different. Because of as we mentioned, the incredible efficacy of guns in this space, and the fact that the majority of gun deaths in this country are deaths by suicide, studies like this that start to give us insight into who is at risk are going to play an ever larger role in this discussion. And I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'm not sure if it's going to get shut down. No, it's illegal to make predictions about people at the point of gun sale. That's a possibility. But is there room? Is there room at some level of risk to mandate some kind of evaluation at least before people can purchase a gun? And will we save lives that way? So that's for the future. If we get some studies like that, we'll certainly talk about it here. Thanks for joining me in this unusual episode of Impact Factor. If you like this format, let me know. Otherwise, next week we'll be back in the studio and with our usually scheduled programming. Thanks.